Today's sermon is titled Voting, 100 Years of Hebetude, to be delivered by Judy Butler. It addresses principle number 2, we affirm and promote justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, and principle number 5, we affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. Judy has been a permanent Cambria resident for 11 years. Prior to moving to Cambria, she worked at a large aerospace company in Dallas for 36 years in the law department and as a lead contract administrator. She was an election judge in Texas and has worked the polls here in Cambria. She volunteered to work the polls this year, but has been informed that SLO County has had over 1,000 people volunteer to work. So apparently she will sit out on the sidelines of what she considers the most important election of her lifetime.
Good morning. I'm not coming up. There we go. All right. Put my glasses on so I can see. The fight to vote. Today, we will hear about the ongoing fight to vote that started in the 1800s and continues today. I've worn my election shirt that I wear when I work the polls. It has some of my favorite pins, a peanut for Carter, a cowboy hat for Johnson, along with pins for working various polls in Texas and California. I also brought this bag of election pins that was started by my husband's father and that we have added to over the years. There are pins for FDR, George Wallace, even though I don't know anybody that voted for him, a lot of Kennedys, a Ross Perot, all the way up to Biden Harris. Too bad we're on Zoom, or I would pass it around to everyone. Now, to get on with it today. Voting, 100 years of Hebetude. Yes, I know I have used a strange word here, Hebetude, meaning apathy, casualness, complacence, disinterestedness, that's hard to say, disregard, indifference, nonchalance, and unconcern. So let's have a discussion about the 19th Amendment and see if you agree with me that the word Hebetude is fitting. First, what we do know, this is the 100th anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1920. But as the U.S. marks this anniversary of women's suffrage, many are mindful that it originally benefited mostly white women and have been careful to present it as a commemoration, not a celebration. But let's go back a little. In the middle of the blazing summer of 1848, more than 300 people gathered in Seneca Falls, New York, for the nation's very first Women's Rights Conference. By the end of that convention, the participants would vote on 11 women's rights resolutions, including the affirmation that women in the USA should have the right to vote. I should note that this was the only resolution that did not pass unanimously. But despite making proclamations that would impact American women who made up a diverse coalition of women in the suffrage movement, the only male delegate and Black American at Seneca Falls was Frederick Douglass. Decades later, in August 1920, the U.S. finally ratified the 19th Amendment, most often remembered as the moment when women got the right to vote. I feel like I should note here that California had enfranchised its female citizens nearly a decade earlier, and 21 U.S. states allowed women to vote as early as 1918. And being from Texas, I'm happy to say that Texas was among the groups of states to ratify the amendment, even though my father always maintained that Texas was fine for men and horses, but it was hell on women and dogs. Whenever I hear the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, I immediately think about my mother. She was born in 1919, and at that time, women couldn't vote. It always brings me up short to think I'm only a generation away from that disgrace. Lucky for us women, we had some iron-jawed Unitarian Universalist women fighting for us. Women such as Olympia Brown, Susan B. Anthony, Clara Barton, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and many more. Did you know that Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the mother of 7 children? Susan B. Anthony would babysit Stanton's children, while Stanton wrote suffrage speeches and petitions that Anthony would deliver. Now, what did most of these women have in common? It was a freedom to follow their own calling that many women or men are rarely capable of being able to do. They inspire by their sheer audacity, their capacity to simply step through the laws, rules, and mores of the time and act according to their own inner light. I thank them for their courage, their vision, and their absolute refusal to take no for an answer. However, could these women have imagined that in the fantastically distant world of 2020, women would still be fighting for some of the same things: political power, equal treatment under the law, and wage parity, or that not one woman would have yet made it to the highest political office? Would they be dismayed, as I am, that in 2020, women are subjected to the same sexist insults that were hurled at the suffragists who dared to suggest they should be treated as equals? But in fact, the 19th Amendment was not a guarantee of enfranchisement for all women, but rather a guarantee that states could not bar people from voting due to their sex. This left ample room for states to suppress and disenfranchise on the basis of wealth and race. And they quickly did that through Jim Crow laws, which included poll taxes, literacy tests, etc. As with the convention at Seneca Falls, Black women, many of whom had fought long and hard for women's enfranchisement, were largely left behind, even as the white-dominated National Suffragist Organization moved on. 100 years after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, I'm going to take a sip of water. 100 years after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, we are still grappling with its fractured, incomplete outcomes. As noted by the organizer director at a women's voting rights organization, it is important to acknowledge that the 19th Amendment did not give the right to vote to all women. In fact, much of the movement at that time excluded and marginalized the voices of Black women in particular. In that space, we still have a long way to go. The 100th anniversary has arrived during a year of nationwide protests against racial inequality that have forced the United States to once again reckon with its uncomfortable history. Many in the first generation of suffragists were also abolitionists and had set aside their goal of enfranchisement for women to help in the fight against slavery during the Civil War. Once the North won, many suffragists believed that all people should be given the right to vote. Instead, suffragists were asked to support the 15th Amendment, which only extended the right to vote to Black men. A group of white suffragists believed that if only one group should get the vote first, it should be white educated women. To see Black men enfranchised over white women infuriated them. The causes of abolition and women's suffrage, once compatible, became increasingly at odds with one another. In the late 19th century, as women were fighting for the right to vote, Southern states were busy disenfranchising Black men by using the poll tax, literacy tests, etc. On a personal note, I've gotten one off here, excuse me. There we go. The poll tax was still in effect when I cast my vote in the 60s in Texas. In cleaning out some paperwork recently, I found this receipt for a poll tax my husband paid in Texas in 1966. I remember as a child moving from New England to Texas in the early 50s. When my father went to vote for the first time in Texas, he got so angry when they informed him he had to pay a poll tax, and he exploded at the idea that he had to pay a tax to vote, as it violated all his ideals of being an American. I'm going to back up one here. Here we go. Some white suffragists were actively hostile to Black voting rights, while others were not overtly racist, but still comfortable with excluding Black women. The National American Women's Suffrage Association, founded by Stanton, Anthony Catt, and Stone, decided it would be politically expedient to simply exclude Black women. So some Black suffragists, Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman among them, formed the National Association of Colored Women. We all know the names of the famous women involved in the suffrage movement. And while these white women did play a major role in the eventual ratification of the 19th Amendment, there were plenty of Black women and other women of color who fought for those rights too. And they were ultimately failed by the movement. Sojourner Truth, who's on the first picture on the slide here, an emancipated slave who died in 1883, is considered one of the first known Black suffragists. She traveled through the U.S. speaking at women's rights conventions and suffrage events. In Ohio, at a women's convention in 1851, she was credited with giving a power speech that's been remembered as "Ain't I a Woman?" It was an impassioned speech that laid bare all that Black enslaved women had struggled through, only to be denied a role in a movement pretending to fight for women's equality. In 1913, when a second generation of suffragists arrived on the scene, the National Women's Party was organized, along with a parade of 5,000 to 10,000 white women marchers on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. A smattering of Black suffragists arrived to march, including members of a Howard University sorority. They were instructed to march in the back. The tide for suffrage turned. Now, I got my pages stuck together. Hold on. The tide for suffrage turned when a referendum on women's right to vote passed in 1917 in New York. Black women's clubs and the NAACP organized around the push and were integral in the passage of the referendum. Southern politicians were terrified of Black women becoming enfranchised, saying that will be the end of white supremacy if Black women get the vote. Histories of the women's suffrage movement also fail to mention the contributions of Indigenous and Asian American women. At a time when the U.S. government's policy regarding Native people consisted of land grabbing and forced assimilation, American Indians were not even considered citizens of the United States. When the Snyder Act of 1924 admitted Native Americans born in the U.S. to full U.S. citizenship, It was left up to the states to decide who had the right to vote. And it took more than 40 years for all 50 states to agree to grant them voting rights. Native women like Sikala Sa of the Yankton Dakota Sioux worked to obtain citizenship and voting rights for Native people. As I was doing some research, I started reading some of the things that this woman had written, and I am now going to try to find, I believe she's written a couple of books. It's just totally amazing. White suffragists were inspired by the matriarchal structures of many indigenous tribes, particularly women in the Iroquois Confederation, and invited them to speaking engagements and parades. In 1913, at the same parade where Ida B. Wells, the Black suffragist, was told to walk somewhere else, white women wanted to include a float for Native women that was decorated to represent Native women in buckskin and braided hair. A member of the Chippewa tribe saw through that stunt and decided that instead of organizing the float, she would march with her classmates and teachers from the Washington College of Law. And although Asian Americans didn't technically exist at the time, due to laws against Asian immigrants' naturalization, Asian women suffragists still existed. Mabel Ping Hua Lee, the lady in the lower right of the slide, a Chinese immigrant, was a prominent figure in the New York women's suffrage movement by age 16. She led a parade for suffrage in New York City on horseback in 1912 and advocated for women's suffrage, even though she knew she wouldn't personally benefit from the passage of the 19th Amendment. The bad press that swirled around the treatment of suffragists in prison, as well as women's essential roles in World War I, finally forced President Woodrow Wilson's hand to support women's suffrage. One of my favorite stories of the 19th Amendment is set in Tennessee. It was the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in that summer of 1920. It came down to one swing vote. A 24-year-old legislator surprised his conservative colleagues by voting for ratification, becoming the vote that secured a 2/3 supermajority to make it official. At the time he voted, there was a letter from his mother in his pocket saying, "Be a good boy and vote for the suffrage amendment." Thank goodness there was one son who listened to his mother. So nearly a century after suffragists won the right to vote, many American women are still struggling to cast their ballots. In Black and brown communities especially, women face barriers to voter registration and early voting access, as well as a strict voter ID requirements, legacies of the Jim Crow era. Many women, especially low-income women, struggle to take time off to get to the polls because Election Day is not a national holiday. And when they finally arrive, they're often met with hours-long lines and broken machines. Transgender women and gender non-conforming people are often turned away at polls because the name or gender marker on their IDs does not match how they present. Immigrant and indigenous women still face many hurdles before getting to the ballot box. So the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment is not a time for simple celebrations, but for more complicated reckonings and calls to action. So as we mark the centennial of women's suffrage in America, it is necessary to honor the work of white suffragists by acknowledging both their triumphs and their flaws. But we must also elevate the bravery and dignity of Black, Native, and Asian women who campaigned for the same cause. 127 women currently serve in the U.S. House and Senate. Female jurists sit on the Supreme Court. And a woman of color, one who is not just Black but also Asian, has become the Democrats' vice presidential nominee. And it is women who are seen as pivotal swing voters in this election. The political, social, and economic parity the suffragists dreamed about a century ago has been long delayed, but it is coming. Let's not put it off any longer. Hebetude, indeed.